Good morning again. I'm Pastor Luke, and this morning we're going to be looking at that baby, at Emmanuel, at Jesus. You may have noticed, but the halls have been decked, and we've added some things to the walls, and gonna start a series on looking at some of the Christmas carols. Because one of the difficulties of Christmas, I think, of the Advent, is everything is so familiar, right? You grew up with all of it. Even if you didn't grow up in a Christian family going to church every morning, you still grew up with all of the Christmas stuff. You still heard the story of Jesus in a manger, of shepherds and wise men. Every year you would hear the same carols, watch the same movies. And they have sentimental value, which is great and wonderful, and family is wonderful, but it can so often hijack your heart and take it down this purely emotional track instead of letting these words address your heart and letting you see the importance of them, the reality of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to overcome that natural tendency this morning. We're going to do things a little bit different. We're going to look at a Christmas carol. And I just got to say, have you ever thought, just about every musical artist out there has a Christmas album? It's just something that, as I was just kind of thinking about this morning, just kind of struck me, or last night, that it's like every, from Mariah Carey to the Beach Boys to Christian singers, like everyone has some kind of Christmas album. Just something I thought was odd. But songs, they tell a story, right? And I'm excited because this morning we're going to be looking at what's my favorite Christmas carol, the oldest carol, O Come, Emmanuel. And we're going to examine the story it tells us about Emmanuel, about Jesus. It was written in the 8th century, so we're talking 1,200 years ago, and it's soaked with Bible. So I'm actually going to be preaching from the carol. We're going to look at how the carol tells the story that we see in the Bible and explore that story. And we're going to focus on two things. One is the meaning of Emmanuel, and then second is the mission of Emmanuel. First off, the meaning of Emmanuel. It's not a common word or name that we hear much today. The thing is about, a lot of these carols, they use words that you don't hear anywhere else, right? Like words like "hark, the herald angels sing." I do not hear "hark" other than that song, right? What is a hark? What does it mean to hark? I don't know. My mom, wife Jen, and I were having this debate the other day about Noel. The first Noel. What does Noel mean? We had to Google search it. It turns out it's a French word that just means Christmas. I don't know why we're using French words in English songs about Christmas, but I guess it sounds nicer. I don't know. But coming back to Emmanuel. O come, Emmanuel. Where does that come from? Where's this coming from? Well, it comes from the Bible in Isaiah chapter 7. If you'll turn there with me. Isaiah chapter 7, starting off in verse 10. Let me just get there myself. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and will call his name Emmanuel. Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a Hebrew name which literally means God with us. Emmanuel. El is the name for God, so El, God. Ema is with, Emma, with, and then nu is the suffix us, first plural. So Emmanuel, God with us. And what's happening here in Isaiah 7? Just want to give you a bit of the backdrop. Ahaz is the king of Judah, of the kingdom of Judah, of Jerusalem. And he's real, I don't know what the biblical word is. He's kind of a bonehead, a nitwit. I think that's somewhere in the Hebrew. And when Ahaz first became king, he got whooped on pretty bad by a couple of neighboring nations. And now there's this imposing threat, this alliance of Syria and their kind of sister kingdom of the northern kingdom of Israel. And they formed an alliance, and they're threatening to conquer Ahaz and his kingdom. And so Ahaz, he's afraid for his security, his reign, his rule, for his kingdom. And so the Lord raises up a prophet, Isaiah, to speak to Ahaz so that Ahaz will not forsake God and his protection by seeking other alliances with a neighboring nation of Assyria. Because Assyria, they were this big superpower, and they had kind of come alongside Ahaz and said, hey Ahaz, look, for a small fee, we'll come alongside you and we'll protect you. It's kind of like one of those movies, where the thugs come and oh yeah, for a small fee we'll protect you. God says to Ahaz, I want you to follow me, to trust me, believe me. So just tell me a sign. Just tell me what you want. And I will give you a sign to let you know that I will protect you, that I am with you. And Ahaz says, no, God, I couldn't put you to the test. And it sounds meek and humble, but it was just false humility. Right? God says, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? It was just false humility because Ahaz, he had already planned and struck an alliance with Assyria. And so a sign from the Lord would just uncover his hypocrisy and show that he does not trust God. Now, it's really easy for us looking back on Ahaz and be like, Ahaz, how could you act like that? How could, here's God, this prophet saying, ask me a sign, and, and you forsake God. How could you act like that? But just allows me to think of my own life. Perhaps reminds you of yours. How many times have you, without meaning to, asked God to show you his will for your life, knowing full well that you won't obey what he wants you to do? How many times have we turned to things other than God for safety, for security, for happiness, for blessing? See, it's that tension that you and I wrestle with. Why would God want to show me the glimpse of what he has designed me to do when I have yet to put my blank check of obedience on the table for him to write? So, we can't go so in on Ahaz because we have been guilty of those things as well. But what I love about our God is even despite Ahaz's false humility and unfaithfulness, despite our frustration and lack of trust in God, he still gives Ahaz a sign that he and the nation benefited from, and a sign that we benefit from today, a sign that would break the boundaries between God and us. See, in that day, there was a child called Emmanuel, who was a reminder to Ahaz and the people that God was with them. And that's what that name means, Emmanuel, God with us. But for us, and the wording of that Hebrew prophecy, it carried a future fulfillment that's fulfilled in Matthew 1, verse 23. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Just want to break down that meaning for us. Jesus is God, right? God with us. The simple meaning of Christmas is, the Creator, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, King of the universe, has become a human being. You just think of, right, how innocent, a baby is. Now, how much they want to connect with you. Jesus, right, God of the universe, became a baby, a child, a human person to be with us. That's the simple message of Christmas. And everything else is secondary. Everything else flows from that. That one simple and earth-shattering claim. God became a human being. Just let that settle in. God with us. But also, God with us. Great God with, all of his might and power and majesty and holiness has put himself into a form of withness. He has entered into an intimate, personal relationship. He is God with us. There's a big difference between experiencing God and being with God. You with me? It's one of those, it's one thing to experience God. It's another thing to be with him, to meet him personally. Jesus, he came and performed many miracles. And there were a lot of people who experienced God, who experienced his power, but were not with him. He wasn't personal. They never met him. See what I'm saying? And I think that's something that we have to be so careful of this time of year. With, the Christmas carols and, even just coming to church. So often, we just come to experience God. Not to meet him, not to let him fill our lives, not to have a personal relationship with him. I think of all of the Old Testament saints and everything that they would go through when they met God. Right? In the Old Testament, God was terrifying. Think of Isaiah. When he comes before the Lord in the temple and there's cherubim and seraphim and he hides his face and says, Lord, I'm undone, I'm unworthy, I can't come before you. Or I think of Moses, right? When he goes to meet the Lord, he says, Lord, I want to see you, I want to meet you. What does the Lord say? He says, it would destroy you, it would kill you. And so instead, what does God do? He goes and Moses sees his backside, sees his back. And even that was so glorious, so amazing, so changed Moses that when he goes back to the people of Israel, his face is so bright that they had to put a veil over his face because it was so blinding. For a couple of days. It says that, they put a veil over his face because just Moses seeing the backside of God was so glorious. Just imagine if Moses heard the message of Christmas. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, it says that Moses had to put a veil over himself, but Christ has removed that veil. Moses, he would be jumping up and down. Do you realize this was the very thing I was denied? Do you realize that you can meet God? He can come into your life. Do you realize what is going on? Where is your joy? Where is your amazement? I think about this, personally, this Christmas time, it can be such a longing for me to be with family. It's been wonderful. My mom's been in town visiting for Thanksgiving. That's wonderful. But both my wife and I, we're not from here, and so both of our families are hours and hours away. And so, the holiday seasons, right, or, birthdays, holidays, right, it's that time where you long to be with family, to connect with them, right, because you want to be with them. You love them. It was convicting to me as I was preparing the message of, do I have that same longing to be with Jesus? Am I leading my family and teaching my children to have this longing to be with Jesus? That Emmanuel, Jesus, came to be with us. Do I have that longing to be with him? Okay, so that's the meaning of Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus is God with us. So now the mission. What was Emmanuel's mission? O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Some words in there that we don't use very often. What does it mean to ransom captive Israel who mourns in lonely exile here? Let me just put it really simply, Jesus came on a rescue mission to ransom us, to purchase us, to buy us by giving his life. This is a direct reference to Isaiah chapter 35, verse 10. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Just a quick history lesson. What's he talking about? Israel and ransoming and exile. So Israel in the Old Testament, right? They made a covenant with God to follow him. God says, look, if I will be your God, you will be my people. You follow me, trust me, obey me, and I will bless you. Well, Israel, they're a little bit like our kids. When, they're like, Mom, Dad, I want a cat, I want a dog. Addie this week, she was begging us because she wanted a gerbil or a hermit crab or something. She's like, and the kids, kids are like, oh, I'll take care of it. I'll do all the chores. I'll feed it and, and clean up after it and all that stuff, right? And, parents, we know how long that lasts. About a day, if that. Well, that's, how long it lasted with Israel. In spite of God's faithfulness and blessing and graciousness, they're constantly disobeying and turning to other gods. And so God is constantly bringing up trials and tribulations in Israel to bring them back, drive them back to himself. And so they come back and they follow him for a little bit. And then their hearts get swayed. They become disobedient again, turn to other gods, trust other people, other things instead of God. Till finally, because of their disobedience, God allowed them to be captured and exiled into Babylon. And they spent 70 years in exile there in Babylon. And then God orchestrated for them to be released and returned to the land of Israel. But the reality is, when Jesus incarnated, though Israel, the Jews, they had come back. They were inhabiting the promised land. They were no longer in physical exile. They were still in spiritual exile. See, that physical exile that they went through was just a picture of our spiritual exile. All right, I said our, because it's not just Israel, it's us as well. How are we in spiritual exile? It's very simple. You think back to Adam and Eve. What happened when they sinned? When Adam and Eve sinned, they're walking with the Lord. They're with him in perfect community with him, right? And they sin, they fall, and they get booted from the garden, booted from his presence, right? They're exiled from the presence of God because he is completely perfect, good, and cannot be with sin. Now, because we have inherited a sin nature like Adam and Eve, and because sin always leads to death, So Paul says in Ephesians 2, we are by nature children of wrath who are spiritually dead. We are disconnected and separated spiritually, exiled from the presence of God. That's our natural spiritual state. And Emmanuel, Jesus, came to ransom the spiritually exiled. He came on a rescue mission to make us alive, to bring us back to God. How did he ransom the spiritually exiled? Well, Jesus says in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many." That word ransom, in the Greek, it means an exchange of currency. Someone that is making a payment to buy a captive who is currently in that enslaved position. So someone must pay the ransom on behalf of that person to buy them back. He came to give his life a ransom for many. That is what Jesus is saying, that he came to do. That's what we sing about. We were in bondage to sin and death, rebels against God. And Jesus came on a rescue mission to give his life in place of mine. Maybe some of you are just have that feeling of an exile. Like, God, there's just so much keeping me from you. God, where are you? Christmas is all about getting close to him. Look at what he did to be with you. Coming, giving his life a ransom for you. What are you doing to be with him? What is keeping you from a sense of his love being continually shed abroad in your heart? How close are we to him? Is it a simple habit that we don't want to give up? Is it a lack of discipline? Are we just too busy, pressed down by other things? Whatever it costs, it's nothing compared to what he did for us. He came as a ransom, giving his life in our place, to purchase us, to buy us back. Let that also fill you with hope. No matter where you are at, how you are feeling, if you're feeling like I'm in exile, when you put your trust in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, he's purchased you. It's been paid for. On the cross, he says, right, it is finished. There's no going back. And so as Paul says in Romans, what can separate us from the love of God? He says, I'm convinced that neither death, nor life, nor height, nor depth, nor anything in this world, nor nothing can separate us from the love of God. Be encouraged with that. So he came as a ransom. For some of you, the Advent season can be kind of gloomy. You're going to look at the next verse. He says, and the next verse, before that, it says, I'll come day spring, come and cheer, all people by that Advent here, disperse the gloomy clouds of night. For some of us, the Advent season can be quite gloomy. Jen and we're not from, like I said, we're not from here. When we first moved here, we moved here in the summer, and as the summer's glorious. It's sunny and shiny and beautiful, and it's, in the 70s. And then October rolled around, and it got a bit gloomy. I'm like, oh, it's all right. And then November comes, and then December, and then January, and then February, and the clouds just kind of stay there and hover over you. sometimes I think we can feel spiritually that way, right? Like there's just this kind of cloud over us, separating us. We don't feel God's presence. And this song says, "Oh, come thou dayspring." Dayspring, it's an old school word for sunrise. This comes from Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone." I tell you a story about a guy, Zechariah. He was a priest. Lived before, right around the time of Jesus' coming. And Luke chapter 1 tells us about his story. And he had heard that his wife, who was rather old, she was past childbearing age, he had heard that she was pregnant. And Zechariah said, this can't be. And he didn't believe God. And so what God does is he makes him mute and deaf. So he can't talk and he can't hear. And he's that way for 10 months. I think that's right, of a baby. And then their baby is born. 9 months, thank you. 4 kids, and I still don't have it down. It feels like 10 years at times. But it probably felt like 10 years for him. 10 months. So she has his wife gets pregnant. He's like, God, I this can't be. It just, she's however old she is, it just can't be. And and so, God makes him mute, makes him deaf. And 9 months pass. She has a boy. And after she has a boy, they're talking about names. Well, what are we going to name him? And so he gets out his tablet. And no, not that kind of tablet, one that you write on. And his stylus. And so he writes down this name, John. And everyone was befuddled. Why name him John? It's not a family name. And then the Lord releases Zechariah's mouth. And Zechariah said, "Praise be to God." That's the first words out. It's praise to God. And he goes into this long song, this long hymn of praise. And he articulates in this song, and right in the crux of the song, he's fully recognizing that my son is the forerunner of the Messiah. The one that comes before Jesus, the one who proclaims Jesus. That's who John is going to be. And then he says, "The sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness in the shadow of death." And Zechariah is saying that the sunrise is coming through the Messiah. And it's the sunrise that chases away the darkness of night. We've had some really nice, clear, beautiful days the past couple of weeks, right? And, if you're up early, now with daylight savings time, you have to be up really early, 5:30, 6 in the morning. But when you're up that early, right, and it's dark out, and then the sun just starts peeking over Mount Baker, and you just have that beautiful, glorious sunrise that disperses the night. That's Jesus' coming. But let's be real and candid with one another. We know in Washington, the weather can be a little gloomy, as I was talking about, right? When the sun finally comes out, when we get those days, what we see is that the sun, we're reminded that, it's not as if the sun went away. The clouds just blocked its visibility for like 6 months. Not that bad. Feels like it's not that. I actually love it. I love that. But so often in life, when the storms of life come, when loved ones are taken from us, when relationships shatter, when it feels like we've flunked out of something, in those kinds of situations, when we're enduring the storms and clouds of life, and the storm rolls in, And we assume because the visibility of the Son, Jesus, is not there, we assume he is no longer Emmanuel, that he is no longer God with us, God with me. And I know that tension, I know that pain, I know it as a believer. But brothers and sisters, he is still Emmanuel. He is still God with you. And it is in that brokenness that I am sympathetic to those in seasons of suffering, especially in this season when depression just seems to put a stranglehold on you. Or when you're feeling frustrated that your loved ones are no longer there. When money just isn't there that you want. Or when you're swept away by commercialism and you've forgotten about Christmas being the incarnation, the substitutionary death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I know what that's like. And perhaps this message today is for you to be recalibrated, to know he can restore you, to know he is with you. The last portion of the song that we'll look at, O come, Emmanuel. O come, desire of nations bind, all peoples in one heart and mind. Bid envy, strife, and quarrels cease. Fill the whole world with heaven's peace. We don't know anything about strife and quarrels in this country, do we? It's interesting. I can order something off of Amazon. I can pull out my phone and order it, and I get it tomorrow. We're just so connected like never before. I can FaceTime or Skype with my family. They're a 40-hour drive away, and I can see them and talk to them on our phone. You can order something off Amazon and get it tomorrow. Can take online classes, talk with anyone, anytime through Facebook, Twitter, or whatever. And yet there is such discord, such animosity between people today. And I just want to open up for a minute about something that I've been struggling with, going through this week. Actually, before I do that, this might not be the best time, but I just want to say that preaching messages, they're not for me a one-way thing. I want it to be a conversation. So if I ever say something that you disagree with, I want you to just give me a call or swing by the church and say, hey Luke, I disagreed with you that, or what do you mean by that, or hey, let's talk about this. I'm sure there's been times where I'm wrong. I'm sure there will be times where I say stuff up here that's wrong. So I don't know where that came from, but just wanted to mention that. But I just want to be real. It's something that I've been struggling with this week. As you probably noticed, my beautiful wife Jen has a limp wing. Many of you probably already know this. We were at the trampoline zone, and I'll let her describe the trick she was trying to pull off. When it happened. No, actually it wasn't. It was just falling down some stairs, which might be worse. But in any case, so it's happened a couple weeks, 3 weeks ago, and it's been really, really difficult. I understood how much she did before, but I have so much more respect for her now, after 3 weeks of her being lame. That's not a bad word, but not being able to walk and not being able to do what she normally does, and that's been really trying on both of us. And I haven't. This week it was a really difficult week for me, and just had a number of quarrels with her. Mostly on my part, just because I felt like, I can't do this anymore. I feel like I'm doing everything, and I'm not doing everything. She's helping out, and we've had our moms here to help out. And it was just a difficult week for me, and I didn't handle it all that well. And so there was strife, there was quarreling. Where does all of that come from? Here's what James, the brother of Jesus, says. He says, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights amongst you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?" He says, here's the issue. It's you. It's sin inside of you. You're chasing after your passions, thinking, if I can just get that, then everything will be good. And you're at war with yourself. And I found that to be so true in my life this week. That the person I wasn't really quarreling with was my wife. It was with myself. That I wasn't happy because I was not right with God. I was not loving her, loving our family, loving Jesus as I should be. Ahaz found this out when he did not trust God. Because here's what happened with Ahaz. Instead of trusting, kind of go back to the beginning, right? Instead of trusting God, instead of following him, Ahaz, he makes a treaty with Assyria. And Assyria, so they come in and they beat up and conquer the northern kingdom. And they conquer Syria and the surrounding region. And then they don't conquer Ahaz and his kingdom, but they make them vassals. They make them servants. And so Ahaz, they just become servants of Assyria. And it's actually interesting. Archaeologists, they discovered this Assyrian tablet. This is 100 years or so ago, but describes the tribute that Ahaz paid to Assyria. They said, you're going to be our servants. You're going to serve us. And Ahaz, he would send precious lumber, money, and even took silver and gold from God's house, from God's temple, and sent it to Assyria. Ahaz became, in essence, enslaved to Assyria. And I was just thinking about, that's us. We become enslaved to sin, to our passions. There's so much striving this time of year. We want everything to be perfect so we can feel good. Every year we talk about the consumeristic nature of Christmas. A big part of that is I think it's because it's true in our own lives. Jesus says, "Come unto me all who are weary, and I will give you rest. I will give you peace." Maybe you feel like you're in exile. Maybe you feel like the gloomy clouds are overhanging you. Or there's this strife in your life. Let me encourage you with this. If Jesus is God with us, then we need to take off the limitations that you have made of him in your life. You have problems, needs, habits in your life, and it's so easy to say, well, that's just the way it's always going to be. That's the way it's been, that's the way it is now, that's the way it's always going to be. It doesn't have to be that way. Jesus, the one with you, is God. He's God. And if he is God, do you think that your bad habit is no match for him? You've got to get rid of that cynicism in your life about what God can do in you and through you and in this church and through this church. And while we look back to the birth of Jesus, that reminds us of the cross, his coming to die for us. That's what we celebrate here this morning. And we look forward to his return when he will bring peace and make all things new. So as I invite the servers up for communion, let me read how John describes it in Revelation. He says, "Behold, The dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more.